Hello, it's Miss Heather, piano and voice teacher at Conservatory of the Ozarks. Just recording another study guide video for Hymnody. So probably not going to be interesting to anybody but me. Probably not even that interesting to me, to be honest. But okay, I have made some flashcards for Hymnody and I'm going to test myself on them. First one, Paul Gerhardt. Okay, so Paul Gerhardt was born maybe in 1635 and maybe died in 1676. And he dominated the era of the Pietist movement. He wrote songs of comfort for Christians. He was a pietist, and he had a horrible life of suffering because he lived during the 30 Years' War, and his life was just plagued by tragedy. Like, his wife died, he had a bunch of kids, and most all of them died, I think. And the political climate at the time was ruled by more of the Orthodox Lutherans, so they were always giving him a hard time. And he I guess it sounds like the cities back then were in charge of the church and paying the minister, and if the minister's sermons didn't meet the approval of the city leaders, then you would just get fired. And so he would go for years at a time without getting paid anything. And in spite of all of that suffering, he wrote all of these really encouraging hymns for believers. He encouraged personal piety, so like an emphasis on having devotions in your home, having a personal relationship with God. His hymns ushered in an era of more depth of emotion in the text for hymns. And when he died, Freylinghausen was only 6 years old, and he became a pastor at the same church where Gerhardt was a pastor in Berlin. And so Freylinghausen kind of brought the era of Pietist hymn writing to an end after Gerhardt's death. A lot of Gerhardt's hymns have millions of verses. Not actually millions, but 12 verses or something. He really had a lot to say. Okay, so let's see if that matches my answer here. Okay, so in the 1600s, Paul Gerhardt brought a more heartfelt tone to hymnody. His hymns had more emotional depth, or brought about an era of more emotional depth in the hymns that followed. They were written to be sung in the home with keyboard accompaniment. I forgot about this part. Which led to a highly ornamented, soloistic style with elaborate realization of the figured bass. This led to a tension between private and group worship. So, he wrote these hymns. He encouraged people to sing them at home. And they just would have, a figured bass and a melody line, I think. Not written out like a hymnal today where there's 4 harmony parts already written out and the piano part is the same as the vocal parts. Instead, it was more like a PVG arrangement today. So you would go home, and on a keyboard you would realize the figured bass, which is the same thing as playing off of a chord chart today, kind of, except more elaborate and complicated. And so it kind of sounds to me similar to praise and worship groups today, where sometimes you'll go to a church and the praise and worship band will be singing in a style that just isn't suitable for a whole congregation to sing. It's fit for a soloist to sing. It's highly ornamented, lots of fast, complicated rhythms and runs and things that not every person is capable of singing. And even people who are capable of singing them, it's difficult to sing things like that in a large group. It's kind of too complicated. It moves too fast, that kind of thing, especially for untrained singers who are singing without even looking at music notation. And so that created this tension between, at home I can do this and I can kind of do whatever I want and it's fun and nice, and maybe I can do that as a solo at church, but how can the congregation sing? So there was that tension that his hymns kind of created, I guess. And then Freylinghausen's hymnal, after Gerhardt died, it came out, actually after Freylinghausen died, it came out, it blurred the distinction between private home devotional music and group worship music for inside of a church service. So that's my Paul Gerhardt flashcard. Let's see what we have next. Oh, look at that. Johannes Freylinghausen. So, oh, I forgot to check Paul Gerhardt's birth and death dates. Oh, I guess I didn't write them down. Well, that was bad of me. I'll have to add them later. So, Freylinghausen was born to an Orthodox family and was exposed to Pietist writings and chose to go to a Pietist school. Like, he was already at college, but his roommate exposed him to these Pietist writings, and Freylinghausen was like, oh, that sounds great, I identify with that. So he transferred to a different university, I forget the name of it, somewhere in Germany, so he could study Pietist writings and study with Pietist professors. And his father was a minister, I guess, and so the city leaders made this list of prophets' children who shall not be employed in local pulpits, and his name was on that list because he was a pietist. And so his parents freaked out about that, and they're like, don't be a pietist, your life is ruined and everything. But he persisted in his beliefs and went on to be a preacher. Like I said, he was a pastor at the same church in Berlin where Gerhardt was a pastor. And his big work was combining different editions of hymnals, 2 different editions, into one big edition that had like nearly 1,600 hymns in it. And it was called Freylinghausen's Hymnal. Sometimes it was published posthumously in 1741 and used for about a century after that. And the name of it was the Geistliches Gesangbuch, I think. And that means spiritually rich songs when translated into English. It was very controversial when it came out. It was considered to be nearly secular and licentious and hopping and pompous and dactylic and had jumping rhythms and just completely inappropriate for worship services. It was condemned by the Orthodox religious leaders at the time. And it's like, how could you bring this into the church, you horrible person? Freylinghausen, ruining everything. So that's what I remember about him. Let's see what it says here. He lived from 1670 to 1793, and his big contribution to hymnody was Geistliches Gesangbuch, which means spiritually rich hymns. He was accused of being pompous, superficial, licentious, nearly secular, and having hopping, jumping rhythms and being dactylic. And It had 1,600 hymns, about 600 tunes. It was called Freylinghausen's Hymnal. He combined 2 editions to create it. It was posthumously published in 1741 and used for over a century. It eroded the distinction between private devotion and congregational worship. He was 6 years old at Gerhardt's death in 1676. Freylinghausen's Hymnody marked the end of the Pietist era. His legacy was 44 hymns that he wrote. So, looks like I need to call it a day for now. I feel pretty happy with how much information I remember from those 2 cards. Maybe my studying is finally sinking into my brain. Thumbs up for Freylinghausen and Paul Gerhardt.